digital humans, my name's Grayson, the guy in the know. This is just a short video. I wanted to check in regarding a new campaign I started. I know that there's been some demand that you see often on online platforms where players or GMs ask for videos about how people prep or how experienced DMs run their games, that kind of thing. Especially for new players that want to DM, I think this is a really huge help. So I wanted to step on the bandwagon and just start creating some videos again. I used to have a channel for Roll20 content that ended up getting hacked for a cryptocurrency company and taken down as a result. So I'm unfortunately starting from scratch here, but if you enjoyed this video, please share it with your friends or anyone else who might be starting a new D&D campaign. So the genesis of the idea was that I wanted to run a game for new players. I found that when I was working as a line cook, it was very difficult to have the energy to run a campaign consistently, especially with shift switching. So I ended up abandoning the idea and just running one-shots. But within the last year or so, I've been getting really interested in running a campaign again. Since I work in healthcare now, I do have a more consistent schedule where I can coordinate that kind of thing. As a result, I decided that I wanted to run for new players because it had been a while since I ran a campaign, so it would reduce the stress overall. And I also wanted to introduce them to the hobby because I know a lot of games, it's very similar to the problem for trying to get into a new industry for a job. If you don't have the experience, it's hard to get into that industry, right? I feel like when new players are looking at game posts online, they often get sidelined because they don't have the experience or the confidence yet. So I wanted to present this as an opportunity for new players to play, get settled, and introduce themselves in like an easy way. So with that in mind, I started looking for some inspiration. I was initially going to run it using a system called Shadow the Demon Lord. However, I realized that unfortunately D&D 5e is, of course, the most popular system, and it's probably the easiest one for players to find games for. So I wanted to present this as a intro to D&D 5e with like a short 4 to 8 session campaign. So I was looking for inspiration. I watched Matt Colville, and I saw his recap on his campaign called Dusk that used 4th edition. And I thought the premise was really engaging, and the way he presented it was really interesting. The idea of having a small group of villagers that the players are protecting and guiding through a forest. So I used that as the hook for this campaign. That's what excited me, so that's what I wanted to introduce them with. With that in mind, normally I go very, very overboard for my prep. I use a program called Affinity Publisher, which is a professional layout software for book publishing and PDFs and stuff like that. For this campaign, what I decided on doing was mixing index cards, because they have a whole charm to them, and I've seen blog posts over the years that really promote this idea of an index card prep method that's contained, easy to digest content for you as a dungeon master, that you can lay out multiple sections in front of you. When you use up a card, you can just put it away or even just tear it up. You can write notes in the middle of a session. You can add new cards with just the name on top and then fill them in later for improvisation. It's really, really, really helpful. So let's take a look at an example of what I used to prep for a one-shot. So here's a one-shot. It's called Rough Night at the Three Feathers, and will become relevant to the story later on here in this episode. This is what my prep normally looks like for a one-shot. I start with a page using this template that references some of the characters I know about for the one-shot if players share their sheets with me ahead of time. It's got a session premise, which is just a short primer for me, a rough plan of how it's going to go. There's some sections that I skip. So for example, the strong start I don't need for this one. Because I know that this comes from a published adventure and I'm adapting it to a one-shot, I already have an idea of the prep I'm going to use for it. So this is the strong start here. I have a section for rising action for new entities. These are just different character sheets that I should write up. Then I have a quick section for the Three Feathers Inn. I have a quick list of locations and then just roughly some notes on what kind of dangers or opportunities the players might have. From there I have 4 NPCs that end up being relevant to the session. So I've got Rosie the innkeeper, Caleb Marker the bartender, Billy Onsocks the charlatan, and Lady Murray of Ambrose who's a baroness. And then a couple of 2 more NPCs that have combat stats because they'll be relevant if their fighting breaks out. In addition to that, I have the actual prep from that adventure. So I used to adapt the adventures wholesale, which means I would go line by line, and I would, over the course of a couple days, or a couple hours depending, I would adapt it into a 1 or 2 page adventure. So I'd narrow the introduction to a small section, I streamlined the 3 feathers in, the adventure has a bunch of subplots that go along, and then I did a full timeline breakdown of how the adventure presented the events that happened over the course of the adventure. I want to assure you guys that you really don't need to do this level of prep. It's overboard. It's 6 pages, 2 of which are super dense with text, just transcribing the adventure in a much more condensed way so that it's easier for me to improvise at the table and read it. But ultimately, if you're a new DM, people are going to give you a lot of slack. They're not going to be stressing about you having a perfect session, especially if you introduce yourself as a new DM to them. So you really, really, really don't have to stress, especially with new players. With that in mind, I'm going to switch gears and start talking about how I recruited for the campaign. So here's the post I made on Reddit. I made a note that it's using the Dungeons & Dragons rules published in 2014. I made it note so that it's 4 to 6 sessions just to set expectations. I left a little bit of information about the campaign primer. I let players know what website we're going to use and that we're going to use Discord for voice chat. And then I also linked to a little campaign primer. I formatted it in Affinity Publisher and then posted it on a website called Imgur. So this is just a little description. I wanted to include something that was a little more visual as opposed to just straight text. And then from there, what my priorities were was getting a form presented before I posted it on LFG. So this is the form I posted on Reddit. So you'll see I made sure that I had a way to contact them. Once I got the form on Reddit, I had a very long list of submissions. Then I created a scheduling matrix. So I was really pleased with the players I managed to recruit for this. They're wonderful people. I didn't know a whole ton about what characters they were playing going into what ended up being our Session 0 and Session 1 last night. It seemed pretty clear that the players knew, or at least had access to, different resources they could use to teach them character creation on their own, and that was their preference. So there was only one player who ended up playing Rowan, a satyr ranger, who ended up needing my help a little bit. They created a Beastmaster, but the campaign starts at level 1. They ended up building a level 1 character with some level 3 ranger features. So what I did was I made a kind of like a deal with them where they could choose one of the ranger features for level 1 and replace it with the Beastmaster feature they really liked at level 3. And then at level 3 they'll get the ranger feature that they skipped at level 1. And so that way they could start with a pet that they were really excited about, and that way they didn't have to worry about rewriting their character or making any big sweeping changes to it. Other than Rowan, the only 2 characters I knew about were a Grave Cleric and a Wood Elf Druid. Other than that, I didn't know what our 2 veterans were playing. To clarify, the group was 3 new players who had barely any experience, one of whom had watched a lot of actual play but never got to play in a D&D session, and then 2 veterans who had played for a year or 2 years about. Once I recruited everyone, made sure that they were all available at a similar time, I got them all into a server together, had them introduce themselves informally with just their preferred name online, their preferred pronouns, one cool hobby that they have, and how much experience they have in D&D, just so I can get an idea of that. From there, I scheduled the Session 0 for the following Thursday, which ended up being last night. My schedule for that was 1, to talk about the characters, 2, to finish any character sheets that still needed to be finished, 3, introduce the characters and determine any connections between them, and 4, to get started with easing into the adventure. What ended up happening was the first 3 ended up being completed within about 45 minutes, so we were able to have almost a full 3-hour session in all honesty. It was very, very, very exciting for me. The characters ended up being Malk, a Goblin Paladin, Rowan, a Satyr Ranger, Nova, a half-elf druid, Ezrin, a bard that will end up multiclassing into Warlock, and Thomas, a Grave Cleric. So the 2 characters played by veteran players were Malk, the Goblin Paladin, and Ezrin, the bard. So from there we got started with the first adventure. Initially it was a pretty rocky start for me. I hadn't run a session in about 4 weeks, so I was pretty pretty rusty with my initial descriptions. I eased the players in with a third-party adventure from Trollord Games called Rising Knight. It starts off with a gnoll stealing a chalice, and then the players going off to catch them. And so my idea was to connect the two. I wanted the players to have to go out and find the chalice because the villagers think that the drought might have been caused by the chalice being stolen. The player character started to ask some questions. Nova, the druid played by a newer player, mentioned that she wanted to ask regarding if she had healed any of the knights that might have gotten attacked on the night the chalice was stolen. And so they had a little bit of information that I provided from there. I indicated that the chalice was taken north and showed them on a campaign map in Roll20. One of the clerics asked what kind of places that might have taken it to, so I mentioned that there was a temple. I'd already planned to use the Temple of Balian from Rising Knight, so I weaved it in with a little bit of their improvisational description, turning it into a haven for an order of knights that ended up falling in a war against giants many years ago. And so I wrote that down onto a card. From there I asked what they wanted to do, because I was still getting my feet wet back into the DM seat. And the players who were veterans, they suggested that they should go shopping just for some health potions and some other traveling supplies like rations. So I did a couple quick scenes, because they're level 1. I had given them 5 extra starting hit points just to increase their durability, but I also wanted to be very generous with health potions. Normally health potions cost 50 gold pieces, and players don't start with that much money in most campaigns. What I decided was that the alchemist, while he wanted to help them as much as possible, he couldn't go too low, otherwise the ingredients would outweigh the cost of the potion. I let them know that they could buy them for 10 gold a piece, which ended up being a pretty good idea. They haven't used them yet, but they got enough that they should be very survivable as they move up to level 2 and level 3. From there, they decided to go rest in the tavern for the evening, and I had a spark of inspiration. Do you remember that adventure called Rough Night of the Three Feathers from earlier in this episode? I have that printed off along with all my prep notes from previous one-shots. I pulled it off of a bookshelf I have in my apartment. So if the players agreed that they were okay with the idea of a tavern as a way to get eased into it, I pulled it out, started riffing on it using the prep notes. So I introduced itself as the rain was going to be starting to come, so they ended up in the tavern before a lot of the NPCs arrived. And what I ended up doing was I ended up taking out a lot of the subplots. The only subplot I kept in was the idea of 3 disguised priests, but instead of what is written in the adventure, I ended up riffing on it over time. So my improvisation ended up turning it into the lead priest was a lesser vampire. The 2 other priests were blessed by the god of battle and given some extra benefits from that made them a little bit harder to kill. And I started it off with it being suspicious, obviously, because the priests were coming in during the rain, and they came in with a coffin bound in chains. They asked if they could bring it up to their room for the evening and do some sacraments to ensure it's sealed, because they said it was an ancient zombie king was sealed inside the coffin. My first goal was to hook the grave cleric in, to give them a little bit of sense of adventure to it, and draw on some opportunities for some tension to build, some suspense on the player's end. What I did from there was I had some scenes where they were role-playing a little bit, where they were just talking between themselves, kind of working out this problem, spying on them. The 2 priests ended up heading upstairs and talked about how they were worried that Falden might decide to attack everyone in the tavern. As one of the players was listening in, he heard them riffling through some of their belongings and pulling out a package. So he comes downstairs, shares that with the PCs. Then they come downstairs, bring the package over to the lead priest. So the priest unlocks the package. It's a small iron box, and he grabs a key from around his neck, unlocks it, and then it immediately opens up. From there, this gust of eerie wind comes into the tavern. Soul starts pouring out in like these ghostly, glowing, ethereal forms. The players are immediately ready for battle. I end up laying out a battle map in Roll20. The combat ends up being pretty straightforward with some interesting mechanics I improvised from the lesser vampire. I made sure that he was a 201 enemy, but it ended up not really mattering because I ended up rolling terribly the whole combat. So with that in mind, as the combat wound down, they killed the lead priest, they killed the other 2. The box closed as soon as the lead priest Falden died. And then they looked around. The bartender was still alive. He had cowered behind the counter and managed to avoid getting his soul sucked out. Unfortunately, one of the other NPCs who had arrived was an elven agent, kind of in disguise a little bit. And she was found body completely cold. Everything had shut down all at the same time, according to a medicine check. And her soul had quite evidently been sucked out. One of the players ended up walking over to the box to ritually cast Identify. And so I have him roll a wisdom saving throw, which he succeeds at, luckily. And after his ritual cast ends, he realizes that it's a box of souls. That there are 7 souls currently in the box, and they can be used for casting spells in place of a spell slot. From there, they go out to check on the coffin that the priest had left inside of the stables. What they find is the lid is burst open, the chains have snapped, and there's nothing inside of it. The grave cleric uses his Eyes of the Grave to try to see if there is a undead presence within 60 feet of them, and it's no undead presence. There are footprints leading east. So I gave them a choice. Do they want to follow after the whatever was inside the coffin heading east, or do they want to head north to collect the chalice? They decided on going for the chalice first and then deciding on what to do after that. And so we wrapped up that session, and moving on to the next one, we will be having them traveling north to secure the chalice. So with that said, it ended up being a really successful session. I had only like a small paragraph of initial notes for how I was going to start off the adventure, and I was planning to improvise most of it. But grabbing the Rough Knight of the 3 Feathers was brilliant, actually. I ended up using most of the adventure, but what I found was that just having that extra little bit of inspiration and guidance made me feel more confident as a DM, and helped build me up to really wipe off the rust from being so far away from the DM seat for so long. The other lesson I learned is that index cards are super helpful. As I was improvising names for NPCs, I could just write the NPC's name down on a card, and then I would just be able to keep that card next to me in case I wanted to add more details, like, oh hey, Tegan is now the Village Elder. And now I can use those cards when I'm prepping for the next session or when recapping this session. I can just take notes or expand on them, and it's all much more coherent than if you were to write it down in a notebook and then try to find ways to get it into your prep notes from there. From there, I also used a zombie stat block for the priests. Last thing I did was I used a couple tables that I've made myself using reference from old 3.5 edition magic items. So I rolled a couple of items. One was a Boots of Swiftness, which ended up being written in 5e, so I didn't have to worry about creating a description for it. One was a Potions of Fox's Cunning, which is in 5e, but as part of a larger spell. Basically, the potion I decided was going to, for 1 hour, all intelligence checks would have advantage for the person who drinks the potion. So thinking about the session, it went really well in my opinion. A couple of the players reached out afterwards, just worried about hogging the spotlight a little too much, and I reassured them that I don't think they did. Yeah, I'm excited for the next Thursday. That's it for the video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll hopefully be able to do a couple more of these campaign diaries and just GM prep recaps in hopes that it might help new DMs feel more comfortable sitting behind the screen for the first time. Best wishes.